I didn't feel joyful. I was scared. I was afraid. And it wasn't anxiety. They were like panic attacks,
Yeah.
which are different.
Late at night, long after the laughter has drained from the studio lots and the talk shows have moved on, the image of Goldie Hawn still glows in America's memory like a porch light that never went out. But behind that famous warmth, there was a colder truth Hollywood rarely admits. Some men didn't just underestimate her. They tried to reduce her to a giggle, a body, a decoration. In the years when ego ruled the room and sexism wore a tuxedo, Goldie quietly built a private ledger of 5 encounters that left scars no award could cover. And sitting at the top of that list is the one man who turned comedy genius into cruelty, Bill Murray. Tiptoe. The clash with Bill Murray did not explode with shouting or headlines. It unfolded in a quieter, more humiliating way inside a room meant for collaboration. A table read in the late 1980s, a space where respect is the minimum requirement. For Goldie Hawn, professionalism was never optional. She arrived, prepared, focused, ready to work. Murray arrived as he often did back then, late, disheveled, and already bored by the process. Those who were present would later recall the imbalance in the room. Murray leaned back, cracked jokes at the wrong moments, skimmed pages as if the material owed him nothing. When Goldie stepped into her lines, she did what she had always done. She acted with intention, not with noise, not with excess, but with control. That was when Murray laughed, not at a joke, at her. Then came the line that changed everything. He looked at her and said with a smirk that landed like a slap, "Why don't you try acting like you've ever done a serious film before?" In one sentence, he erased decades of work. He dismissed her intelligence, her range, her discipline. The subtext was clear to everyone in the room. You are a lightweight, a clown, a blonde who wandered into a space meant for men who matter. For Goldie, it wasn't just insult, it was recognition. Recognition that no matter how many films she carried, how many audiences she won, some men would always see her as decoration. What followed is why this conflict still resonates so deeply with older American audiences. Goldie did not defend herself. She did not raise her voice. She did not seek allies. She simply stood up, gathered her things, and walked out. The room froze. Murray was left mid-performance, mid-arrogance, suddenly exposed. Her silence was not weakness, it was judgment. And it landed harder than any argument could have. Hollywood is accustomed to tantrums. It is less accustomed to women leaving without permission. That exit sent a message Murray was not used to receiving. Your genius does not excuse your contempt. For Goldie, the decision carried consequences. Walking away from a powerful man always does. Opportunities narrowed, invitations cooled. The industry does not punish loud women as harshly as it punishes women who quietly refuse to play along. This incident crystallized a pattern Goldie would recognize again and again. Men who thrived on chaos felt threatened by her steadiness. Men celebrated for being difficult resented her preparation. Murray's brand of masculinity relied on unpredictability. Goldie's relied on control. In that room, only one of those could survive without apology. Years later, Murray's reputation as brilliant but impossible would be openly discussed. Goldie never publicly revisited the moment in detail. She didn't need to. Her career spoke for itself. She continued working. She continued producing. She built a life that valued mental health, balance, and joy, everything that kind of masculinity mocked. That is why this conflict belongs at the top of the list. It was not the loudest. It was the clearest. A man mistook cruelty for wit. A woman chose dignity over access. And Hollywood, watching silently, learned exactly how high the price of self-respect could be. The second fracture cut deeper because it wasn't born on a film set. It was born in private, where rejection wounds the ego far more than criticism ever could. And the man who carried that wound was Warren Beatty. In the 1970s, Beatty was not just a star, he was the star, a symbol of male freedom, sexual conquest, and unchecked power. Women didn't turn Warren Beatty down, they orbited him, until Goldie Hawn didn't. When his interest met her refusal, something in him shifted. For Beatty, it wasn't simply about desire, it was about control. And losing that control demanded repayment. At first, the consequences were invisible. Scripts that once found their way to Goldie's doorstep quietly disappeared. Meetings dissolved. Directors suddenly became unavailable. Nothing could be traced directly to Beatty, and that was the point. This was not rage. This was retaliation disguised as coincidence. In Hollywood, power rarely announces itself when it punishes. It just rearranges the room and lets silence do the work. Years later, when they were forced back into the same orbit on the doomed production Town and Country, the score was settled openly but still without witnesses willing to speak. Beatty, now wielding authority behind the camera, exercised it relentlessly. Scenes were repeated endlessly. Simple moments were broken down and rebuilt until exhaustion set in. Goldie was not being directed. She was being tested, pushed, worn down. The message was unmistakable. You don't say no to men like me and walk away untouched. For audiences over 60, this conflict lands with particular weight because it exposes a truth many women of that generation understood instinctively. Refusing a powerful man did not end the interaction. It began a quieter war. Goldie never accused Beatty publicly. She never framed herself as a victim. But the pattern was visible to those who knew how Hollywood worked. Her independence came with a cost, and Beatty made sure she felt it. What makes this clash especially painful is its hypocrisy. Beatty built a public image as a progressive thinker, a man ahead of his time. Yet behind closed doors, his behavior reflected the oldest instinct of all: punish the woman who refuses submission. Goldie's crime was not ambition or disobedience. It was autonomy. This conflict earns its place because it reveals how sexism adapts. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits, it smiles, and then it quietly removes the ground beneath a woman's feet. Goldie survived because she had already built something. Beatty couldn't touch her audience, her resilience, her sense of self. But the scars of that retaliation lingered, shaping how she moved through Hollywood ever after. The third confrontation was colder, sharper, and in many ways more revealing, because it came wrapped in the language of art. The man across from Goldie Hawn this time was Dustin Hoffman, one of the most celebrated method actors of his generation, and a symbol of intellectual seriousness in Hollywood. The setting was not a party or a chaotic rehearsal. It was a screen test in the early 1980s, the kind meant to signal reinvention. Goldie was deliberately stepping away from the roles that had made her famous. She wasn't there to charm. She was there to be taken seriously. Hoffman, however, had already decided she didn't belong. From the start, his body language told the story. Impatience, distance, a gaze that looked past her rather than at her. When Goldie performed, she did so with restraint, aware that this was a moment meant to redefine how she was seen. That was precisely what irritated him. Halfway through, Hoffman stopped the scene. He didn't speak to Goldie. He turned to the producers as if she were invisible and said, "She's still acting like she's in a sitcom." The words landed like a verdict, not a critique, a dismissal. In one sentence, he reduced her entire career to a punchline and signaled to everyone in the room that she was not a peer. The implication was brutal and unmistakable. Comedy is not real acting, and women who succeed at it should know their place. For Goldie, the humiliation was not just professional, it was existential. She realized that no matter how carefully she prepared, some doors were guarded by men who had already decided who was worthy of seriousness. What makes this clash resonate with older audiences is how familiar it feels. Many remember a time when intelligence was coded as masculine and joy as feminine and therefore shallow. Hoffman represented that hierarchy perfectly. His seriousness was treated as depth. Goldie's warmth was treated as a flaw. The irony, of course, is that Hoffman himself later acknowledged the damage of such attitudes. But at the time, The imbalance of power was absolute. Goldie did not explode. She did not argue. She absorbed the moment and walked away with a painful clarity. This was not about talent. It was about permission. And permission was something men like Hoffman believed they alone could grant. The experience hardened her resolve. If seriousness required erasing who she was, she would refuse the exchange. This confrontation earns its place because it exposes sexism at its most respectable. No shouting, no insults shouted across a room. Just a quiet, devastating reminder that for women, even success could be weaponized against them. Hoffman went on, celebrated and untouchable. Goldie went on too, but with the knowledge that her smile would always be used as evidence against her. The fourth conflict was louder, more poisonous, and impossible to hide, because it unfolded day after day on a working film set. This time, the man was Chevy Chase, and the emotion driving it was not misunderstanding or wounded pride, but something far less flattering: jealousy. During the production of Foul Play in 1978, Chevy Chase believed the spotlight belonged to him. He was the rising king of comedy, the man studios were betting on. Goldie Hawn was supposed to be the charming counterpart, the support. That hierarchy collapsed almost immediately. Audiences gravitated toward Goldie. Her timing was effortless, her presence magnetic. Without trying to dominate the frame, she owned it, and Chase felt it slipping away. What followed was a slow campaign of toxicity. On set, Chase interrupted her scenes with off-script remarks, undercutting moments that required rhythm and trust. Between takes, he mocked her, not as playful banter but as erosion. The comments grew more personal. He hinted that her success had less to do with talent and more to do with her body. It was a familiar tactic in Hollywood. When a woman outshines you, reduce her achievements to biology. Goldie endured it longer than most would have. She had learned by then that reacting publicly only fed the narrative that women were difficult. But the strain was real. Later, she would admit that working alongside Chase drained her to the point of despair. The laughter audiences saw on screen masked an environment where hostility simmered constantly. At one point, she confided to friends that if she ever had to pretend joy next to him again, she would rather leave acting altogether. For viewers over 60, this conflict cuts close to home because it mirrors workplaces they remember well. A talented woman enters a male-dominated space. Her success threatens established hierarchies. The response is ridicule, sabotage, and cruelty disguised as humor. Chase's behavior was tolerated because he was funny and male and profitable. Goldie's discomfort was expected to be absorbed quietly. This clash matters because it shows how sexism often hides behind comedy. Jokes become weapons. Laughter becomes cover. Chase could always claim he was just kidding. Goldie had no such shield. She was expected to smile through the insult, reinforcing the very image that invited contempt in the first place. In the end, Foul Play succeeded, but the partnership did not endure. Goldie moved forward, careful about whom she trusted. Chase's reputation as a difficult, abrasive colleague followed him for decades, eventually confirmed by many others. Goldie never needed validation. Time provided it. What once felt like personal cruelty was later recognized as a pattern, and in that recognition, her silence was finally understood not as weakness, but as survival. The fifth and final confrontation arrived much later, long after Goldie Hawn had nothing left to prove. And perhaps that is why it was so revealing. This time, the disrespect was not whispered on a set or hidden behind professional rivalry. It was delivered openly, in public, by Sean Penn, a man celebrated for seriousness, political intensity, and moral authority. The setting was a charity event in Malibu in 2014, dedicated to mental health, a cause Goldie had committed herself to for decades. By then, she was no longer just an actress. She was an advocate, a philanthropist, a woman using her platform to speak about emotional well-being and the damage done by stigma. Standing at the podium, she spoke earnestly, without performance, without irony. And that sincerity seemed to irritate Penn almost immediately. From his seat, he made no effort to hide his contempt. He rolled his eyes. He sighed audibly. Then, loud enough for those nearby to hear, he muttered, "Here we go again, another celebrity lecture." The room stiffened. Goldie continued, choosing dignity over confrontation. But Penn was not finished. He followed with a remark that cut deeper than insult, because it echoed decades of condescension she had faced. She should probably stick to giggling. In that moment, Goldie was no longer a humanitarian or a producer or an Oscar-winning actress. She was reduced, publicly, to a caricature, a smiling woman whose joy was treated as evidence of intellectual emptiness. For audiences over 60, the cruelty of that reduction is painfully familiar. Many remember a time when women were dismissed not because they lacked intelligence, but because they refused to cloak it in anger. What makes this clash especially disturbing is the imbalance of intention. Goldie was there to help. Penn was there to judge. His brand of masculinity equated seriousness with depth and warmth with frivolity. In his worldview, joy was not credibility. Compassion was not authority. And women who embodied both were suspect. Goldie never responded publicly. She didn't need to. The silence spoke volumes. By that stage of her life, she had learned that engaging with bullies only validates their behavior. Instead, she continued her work, expanding programs, funding research, and reaching people Penn never would. His comment faded into anecdote. Her impact did not. This final conflict closes the circle. From Bill Murray's mockery to Warren Beatty's retaliation, from Dustin Hoffman's intellectual dismissal to Chevy Chase's jealousy, and finally Sean Penn's public belittlement, the pattern is unmistakable. Goldie Hawn threatened men not by challenging them directly, but by refusing to become hard, bitter, or small. She remained joyful in spaces that equated joy with weakness. And perhaps that was the greatest provocation of all. When these 5 men are placed side by side, a pattern emerges that says far more about Hollywood than it does about Goldie Hawn. None of these conflicts were born from incompetence, none from scandal, none from failure. They were born from something far more threatening in a male-dominated industry. A woman who refused to surrender her joy in order to be taken seriously. Bill Murray mocked her professionalism because chaos was his weapon. Warren Beatty retaliated because rejection bruised his ego. Dustin Hoffman dismissed her because intellect, in his world, belonged to men who frowned. Chevy Chase undermined her because audiences loved her more. Sean Penn belittled her because compassion made him uncomfortable. Different men, different decades, the same reaction. Goldie did not fit the mold they needed women to occupy. For viewers over 60, this story feels uncomfortably familiar. Many lived through an era when women were expected to choose between being liked and being respected. Goldie Hawn committed the ultimate transgression. She chose both, without asking permission. She laughed, she smiled, she built a career rooted in warmth, and when men tried to shrink her into a joke, she refused to harden herself just to prove she belonged. What makes her legacy enduring is not that she won these battles. In many cases, she paid a price. Roles disappeared, doors closed, opportunities shifted, but she never allowed bitterness to replace identity. She walked away instead of screaming. She built instead of retaliating. She chose a life where mental health, family, and purpose mattered more than appeasing fragile egos. Hollywood often rewards those who dominate. Goldie Hawn quietly rewrote the rules by surviving without becoming cruel. That is why her story still resonates. Not because she fought loudly, but because she endured intact. In an industry that tried repeatedly to reduce her to a giggle, she proved that joy can be strength, kindness can be authority, and walking away can be the most powerful statement of all. And perhaps that is the question her story leaves behind for every generation that watches her. Why does a woman who refuses to be broken make so many